Hello, this is Mr. White. We are on Chapter 9, Change Over Time, and this is Lesson 1, Darwin's Theory. My Planet Diary. Charles Darwin. In 1839, Charles Darwin published his book, The Voyage of the Beagle. Read the following excerpt about an animal Darwin encountered while in the Galapagos Islands. The inhabitants believe that these animals are absolutely deaf. Certainly they do not overhear a person walking close behind them. I was always amused when overtaking one of these great monsters, as it was quietly pacing along, to see how suddenly, the instant I passed, it would draw its head and legs, and uttering a deep hiss, fall into the ground with a heavy sound, as if struck dead. I frequently got on their backs, and then giving a few raps on the hinder part of their shells, they would rise up and walk away. But I found it very difficult to keep my balance. What was Darwin's hypothesis? In 1831, the British ship HMS Beagle set sail from England on a 5-year trip around the world. Charles Darwin was on board. Darwin was a naturalist, a person who observes and studies the natural world. Diversity. Darwin was amazed by the diversity of living things that he saw during the voyage. He wondered why they were so different from those in England. Darwin saw insects that looked like flowers. He also observed sloths, slow-moving animals that spent much of their time hanging in trees. Today, scientists know that organisms are even more diverse than Darwin thought. In fact, scientists have identified more than 1.6 million species of organisms on Earth. A species is a group of similar organisms that can mate with each other and produce fertile offspring. The exact number of species is unknown because many areas of Earth have not yet been studied. Fossils. Darwin saw fossils of animals that had died long ago. A fossil is the preserved remains or traces of an organism that lived in the past. Darwin was puzzled by some of the fossils he observed. For example, he saw fossils that resembled the bones of living sloths, but were much larger in size. He wondered what had happened to the ancient, giant ground sloths. Galapagos organisms. The Beagle made many stops along the Atlantic and Pacific coast of South America. From the Pacific coast, the ship traveled west to the Galapagos Islands. Darwin observed many unusual life forms there. He compared organisms from the Galapagos Islands to organisms that lived elsewhere. He also compared organisms living on the different islands. Comparisons to South American organisms. Darwin discovered many similarities between Galapagos organisms and those found in South America. Many of the birds and plants on the islands resembled those on the mainland. However, he also noted important differences between the organisms. For example, you can see the differences between the island and mainland iguanas in Figure 2. Darwin became convinced that species do not always stay the same. Instead, he thought species could change and even produce new species over time. Darwin began to think that maybe the island species were somehow related to the South American species. Perhaps, he thought, the island species had become different from their mainland relatives over time. Comparisons among the islands. Darwin also discovered many differences among organisms on the different Galapagos Islands. For example, the tortoises on one island had dome-shaped shells. Those on another island had saddle-shaped shells. A government official in the island told Darwin that he could tell which island a tortoise came from just by looking at its shell. Adaptations. Birds were also different from one island to the next. Look at Figure 3. When Darwin returned to England, he learned that the different birds were all finches. Darwin concluded that the finch species were all related to a single ancestor species that had come from the mainland. Over time, different finches developed different beak shapes and sizes that were well suited to the food they ate. Beak shape is an example of an adaptation, a trait that increases an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. Darwin's hypothesis. Darwin thought about what he had seen during his voyage on the Beagle. By this time, Darwin was convinced that organisms change over time. The process of change over time is called evolution. Darwin, however, wanted to know how organisms change. Over the next 20 years, he consulted with other scientists and gathered more information. Based on his observations, Darwin reasoned that plants or animals that arrived on the Galapagos Islands faced conditions that were different from those on the nearby mainland. Darwin hypothesized that species change over many generations and become better adapted to new conditions. Darwin's ideas are often referred to as a theory of evolution. A scientific theory is a well-tested concept that explains a wide range of observations. From the evidence he collected, Darwin concluded that organisms on the Galapagos Islands had changed over time. Artificial selection. Darwin studied the offspring of domesticated animals that were produced by artificial selection in an effort to understand how evolution might occur. In artificial selection, only the organisms with a desired characteristic, such as color, are bred. Darwin himself had bred pigeons with large, fan-shaped tails. By repeatedly allowing those pigeons with many tail feathers to mate, Darwin produced pigeons with 2 or 3 times the usual number of tail feathers. Darwin thought that a process similar to artificial selection might happen in nature, but he wondered what natural process selected certain traits. What is natural selection? In 1858, Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, another British biologist, both proposed the same explanation for how evolution occurs. The next year, Darwin described his explanation in his book, The Origin of Species. In this book, Darwin proposed that evolution occurs by means of natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which individuals that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce more than other members of the same species. Darwin identified factors that affect the process of natural selection: overproduction, variation, and competition. Figure 5 shows how natural selection might happen in a group of sea turtles. Overproduction. Darwin knew that most species produce far more offspring than can possibly survive. In many species, so many offspring are produced that there are not enough resources, food, water, and living space for all of them. Variation. Members of a species differ from one another in many of their traits. Any difference between individuals of the same species is called variation. For example, sea turtles may differ in color, size, the ability to swim quickly, and shell hardness. Competition. Since food, space, and other resources are limited, the members of a species must compete with one another to survive. Competition does not always involve physical fights between members of a species. Instead, competition is usually indirect. For example, some turtles may not find enough to eat. A slower turtle may be caught by a predator, while a faster turtle may escape. Only a few turtles will survive to reproduce. Selection. Darwin observed that some variations make individuals better adapted to their environments. Those individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce. Their offspring may inherit the helpful characteristic. The offspring, in turn, will be more likely to survive and reproduce, and pass the characteristic to their offspring. After many generations, more members of the species will have the helpful characteristic. In effect, the environment selects organisms with helpful traits to become parents of the next generation. Darwin proposed that, over a long time, natural selection can lead to change. Helpful variations may accumulate in a species, while unfavorable ones may disappear. Environmental change. A change in the environment can affect an organism's ability to survive and therefore lead to natural selection. For example, monkey flowers are plants that do not normally grow in soil that has a high concentration of copper. However, because of genetic variation, some varieties of monkey flower now grow near copper mines. In Figure 6, you can see how natural selection might have resulted in monkey flowers that can grow in copper-contaminated soil. genes, and natural selection. Without variations, all the members of a species would have the same traits and the same chance of surviving and reproducing. But where do variations come from? How are they passed on from parent to offspring? Darwin could not explain what caused variations or how they were passed on. As scientists later learned, variations can result from changes in genes and the shuffling of different forms of genes when egg and sperm join. Genes, such as those for hair color and height, are passed from parents to their offspring. Only traits that are inherited or controlled by genes that are passed on to offspring can be acted upon by natural selection.